While the 2023 vintage in Bordeaux may not reach the heights of the potentially legendary 2022 vintage and is not a vintage of the century, it definitely has the makings of an underappreciated and underrated classic vintage. When you're talking about vintages, everyone always wants to have a comparable vintage. And so when I'm thinking of 2023, the best comp that I can come up with is probably the excellent classic vintage from 2001. As with the 2001 vintage, the 2023 vintage follows one of the so-called vintages of the century. And as with the 2001 vintage, prices are far more reasonable than the vintage before. In many instances, the 2023 bottlings for most producers have prices that are between 20% and 40% lower than the 2022 price. As just one example, in this 2023 vintage, you can get one of the wines of the vintage and a wine that's potentially a 100-point wine for as little as $89. 2023 also reminds me of 2001 in terms of the profile of the wines. These are classic Bordeaux for the most part. Alcohol by volume is definitely more restrained, certainly compared to last year. Most of the wines have less than 14% alcohol by volume and are down about 1% in alcohol by volume compared to 2022. These wines also have more acidity and freshness, and they do have a more prominent tannin profile as well. So they will benefit from some age, but if you have some patience, you'll definitely be handsomely rewarded. I will warn you, however, that it is important to be extremely selective in the 2023 vintage. There were definitely some winners and some losers. Among other things, there were substantial problems with mildew, and some producers fared better than others in the battle against mildew. In addition, Cabernet Sauvignon tends to ripen later in the growing season, and for various reasons, some producers made the decision to harvest their Cabernet Sauvignon before it was completely ripe. This can result in wines that have more pyrazines or green descriptors than some consumers tend to appreciate. Of course, in Bordeaux, weather always has a big impact on the success of the vintage, and through a brief discussion of the weather, we can determine the strongest areas in Bordeaux for 2023. In 2023, the Bordeaux winter was mild and dry. Spring and early summer were warm and humid, however, and then there were some substantial rains in June that caused problems with mildew. And mildew is extremely problematic as it can greatly reduce yields. Many producers had to spend substantial resources to battle this mildew. One producer, for example, had to spray and treat the vineyards 3 times in as little as 7 days. Another producer had up to 26 tractors deployed in the vineyards at just one time. Due to the cost and expense of battling mildew, it's typically producers that are well off financially that are better equipped to withstand these mildew challenges than smaller producers who may have lost a greater percentage of their harvest in 2023. Following the problems with rain, July and the first part of August were relatively cool and uneventful, but then August and September became very warm with a couple different heat waves. So to summarize, the 2 biggest challenges in 2023 were ensuring that grapes such as Cabernet Sauvignon that ripen late were able to get ripe before the harvest, and then also battling the rains. And the producers that are best equipped on both counts are those that tend to have rockier soils. This is so for a couple of reasons. First, rocky soils tend to be quite good for drainage, which was very important during 2023 with the heavy rains. Second, rocky soils also help to assist ripening by absorbing heat throughout the day and then radiating that heat back to the grapes at night. So it's no surprise that in 2023, some of the areas that did well include, on the left bank, some of the top chateaux located along the Gironde estuary that have substantially rocky soils. Also, producers in Pessac-Léognan, and which also has a lot of gravelly soils. Also, producers on the right bank in Saint-Émilion that are located on the limestone plateau. And then some producers in the heart of Pomerol also did quite well.